Hey, Lighthouse, you ready for some morning devotions? We're in Second Thessalonians today. I hope you've read it. Don't listen to anybody talk about the Bible before you've read it yourself and made some notes and done a little study on your own. Hey, could I encourage you, if these videos have been an encouragement to you at all, have been a blessing, would you share them with your friends? Would you encourage people to connect? And we'd also love to encourage you to come to church on a Sunday. Come out and have a Bible study with us on a Wednesday. Check out all the dates and times for anything on the website. The link's below. If you want to give to the ministry, the link is below. But man, we're really a church that is a sweet little family, and so we'd love to have you out on the wood chips on a Sunday morning, and singing some songs and loving Jesus together. Speaking of a sweet little family, Second Thessalonians is just very dear, and if you read it like out of context, you might think, "Oh, well, Paul's just bragging." But actually, you know what I think Paul's doing here is, okay, let me say it this way: I love to tell my kids the story of how their first days in our family. I have two biological kids and two adopted kids. Sometimes I can't remember which are which. But I love to tell my biological kids the story of the day they were born, and one of my sons, I spent the first several hours of his life holding oxygen to his nose. He was fine, but his just little grunting, and so I held oxygen and just stared at him and just like you couldn't believe how beautiful he was and how awesome I thought he was. And one of my daughters was a difficult delivery, and we just were so excited. She's our oldest, and we're just so excited. I went out and bought newspapers for the 13th, because that's the day she was going to be born, and it took 24 hours to get here, and all of those papers were worthless. And she was born on the 14th. And I love to tell them the stories of just, the people that were there and the things that happened. My another daughter who came to our family through adoption, I love to tell her, the day I met you, you were dressed up for Halloween and you were little, and I just fell in love with you the first time I met, and I read you a book, and I thought you were so pretty. And our youngest son, I love to just tell him about the energy he had, and how he just came home and ran around and messed with our dog and the whole thing, and how just right away our heart was just like bound to him, and how much I've loved him from the beginning. And from one perspective, you would think that my wife and I are the heroes of those stories. That's not it at all, is it? Rather, it's us telling the story of how deeply we treasure them coming into our family. All four of them have unique stories, and all four of them are so important to us. And they enjoy hearing the story of how we fell in love with them and how they became part of our family. And I think that's what's happening in Second Thessalonians too. For you yourselves know, brothers, and maybe should be brothers and sisters, that our coming to you was not in vain, but though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. This isn't Paul bragging about his boldness. This is Paul reminding them of the first time they heard the gospel. These people are worried. They're in a stressful part of their life, and it's being difficult to be a Christian in Thessalonica. And Paul's going, hey, do you remember? It wasn't in vain that when I showed up at your town. In fact, I'd been treated badly, but I was bold, and you guys received the gospel. And he tells the story of like, hey, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness, nor did we seek glory from people. Paul's just telling them, hey, we didn't trick you. We weren't trying to get rich off you. Remember, we gave you the pure gospel. Just it was all about Jesus, and you responded to it. Look down at verse 9. For you remember, brothers and sisters, our labor and toil, and we work night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. Remember how we were tent makers? Remember we had that little business in town, Yeah, and we worked day and night and we kept proclaiming. Did you remember how this all started? Man, sometimes, this is why baptism is so important. Sometimes when we have times of discouragement and worry, it is important just to remember how we fell in love with Jesus. Just to hear the story of how we came into the family of Jesus. And Paul wants to take them back to that time when he first met them and tell them the story again, the story they already know. Not so he can brag about, remember, you guys are gems in my crown, but rather so he can tell them, hey guys, do you remember the excitement when you first came to Christ? Do you remember the confidence? Do you remember how in love with Jesus you were? How all the worries of the world didn't matter because you trusted Jesus so much? Man, when I talk about baptism, I say this is one of the reasons to be baptized, and to be baptized now if you're a believer. If you haven't been baptized, be baptized. And many times there's times later of discouragement and of worry, and you think back to when you first came to Christ, when you entered the waters of baptism, when you stood in front of a congregation, when you stood in front of people and said, man, I'm for Jesus and Jesus is for me, and whatever the world brings, I'm not going to waver, but I'm going to be somebody who follows Jesus with my whole life. What an important, you know, statement and a touchstone to go back and remember. So Paul is reminding them of their story. And we also thank God constantly for this, that when you receive the word of God, which you heard from us, you accepted it, not as the word of man, but what it really is, the word of God. Man, he tells them, hey, I looked in your eyes. I remember praying with you to receive Christ. When we gave you the gospel, you responded to it. Man, if you're in a time of discouragement, or if you know somebody who's in a time of discouragement, something that might work, something that might help, is to simply sit down and journal the way you came to Christ. Man, tell yourself the story, or tell it to somebody else. Find a friend and go, hey, I'm discouraged, and I just want to tell you, the pastor said to do this. It's probably a dorky idea, but I just want to tell you what was going on in my life when I came to Christ. Tell the story about the people that were influential. You know, tell the story about your youth pastor who did something, or your parents that led you to Christ, or your friend that lived in the dorm next door, or whoever it was. Tell the story of what was going on in your heart. And remember how confident you were that Jesus would take care of you. And maybe it'll encourage you to be confident today that Jesus will take care of you. Hey, beloved,